My name is Myra Spencer. I'm 36 years old, and I've stitched up strangers at 3 in the morning without my hands ever trembling. A year after my divorce, I was finishing a shift near the maternity ward when my ex-mother-in-law spotted me by the elevators. Carol Bishop had a smile that always looked like a door quietly shutting. She walked straight toward me, smug as Sunday morning, and spoke loudly enough for the nurses nearby to hear. "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made. Now he has a baby boy with your best friend." 6 years of being labeled the broken one were packed into a single sentence. I didn't flinch. I simply looked at her, calm as a flat line, and said, "Is that what you believe?" 5 minutes later, a man neither Carol nor my former best friend expected stepped through that door, and the one name nobody wanted written down was about to be spoken aloud in a courtroom. Welcome back to Quiet Drama Stories, where quiet women endure loud cruelty, and the truth may take its time, but it never misses. If you enjoy a calm kind of justice, settle in. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Let me go back 5 minutes, because the smile came before the man did. It was a Thursday near the end of a 12-hour shift, and I was handing off a chart to a night nurse named Theo. The maternity wing was one hallway over from the emergency department where I worked, and I'd cut through that corridor hundreds of times without a second thought. Carol was there visiting. Of course she was. Paige had given birth 3 weeks earlier, and the entire Bishop side of town had been making their rounds with balloons, casseroles, and congratulations. I knew that. I'd prepared myself for it. What I hadn't prepared for was Carol stepping directly into my path as though she'd been waiting there all afternoon. Her eyes traveled over my scrubs and my tired face, and her chin tilted upward. Then she delivered her line about her son, his baby boy, and my best friend. Theo froze beside me. An aide walking past slowed her pace. I felt my thumb find the thin gold watch on my wrist, the one that had belonged to my grandmother, and press lightly against its face, just as I'd done since childhood, whenever I had to wait through something I couldn't change yet. I didn't raise my voice. I had learned long ago that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one holding the truth. "Is that what you believe?" I asked again, even more quietly. Carol blinked. My calm unsettled her. She had expected tears, anger, at the very least some visible reaction. She got none of those things. And somewhere down the hallway, a set of automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, though I didn't turn to look. Not yet. I didn't know who was arriving, but I knew what I had already put into motion. Before the rest of this makes sense, there's something you should know about me. I grew up in a farming town in southern Ohio, the kind of place where everyone's business quickly becomes everyone else's truth. My mother cleaned houses. My father drove a feed truck until his back finally gave out. I worked 2 jobs through college and another 2 through medical school. Along the way, I learned to keep my head down and let my work speak for itself. For most of my life, that was my entire philosophy. Do good work quietly, and eventually the truth will sort itself out. People will see who you really are. I believed that the way some people believe in luck. It made me good in a trauma bay, where there's no time to panic and no opportunity to explain yourself. You fix what's in front of you, then move on to the next thing. The smell of the hospital, that clean mix of cotton and antiseptic that settles into everything, always calmed me the moment I walked through the doors. It meant I was somewhere I knew how to be useful, somewhere nobody had ever called me broken. I could run a code, reset a shoulder, or guide a frightened child through stitches without my pulse rising. But that same instinct, the one that kept me steady under pressure, had a darker side. I carried everything by myself. I never asked for help. And when people began telling a story about me that wasn't true, I made the worst mistake a quiet woman can make. I trusted that silence would be enough. The hospital was the last place where nobody dared call me hollow. Outside those walls, my life had become something entirely different. I married Mark Bishop when I was 28. He possessed the kind of charm that made strangers feel singled out and appreciated. He remembered names. He shook hands as if he truly meant it. Half the county would have vouched for him. For the first few years, I would have too. We wanted children. We tried for a long time. Nothing happened. And that absence settled into our home like a third person sitting at the table. After about 2 years, I did what any doctor would do. I suggested we both get tested. Simple blood work, a routine evaluation. The same kind of testing I ordered for patients all the time. Mark refused. At first, he laughed it off. Then his tone sharpened. He insisted that Bishop men didn't have those kinds of problems. He wrapped it all in a speech about faith, about leaving things in God's hands. I pushed once. I pushed twice. Then I stopped. Because you can't drag a grown man into a clinic, and because I still believed silence was a form of patience. I got tested on my own. The results came back completely normal. I remember sitting in my car in the clinic parking lot, staring at the paperwork, feeling relieved and confused at the same time. If it wasn't me, then what was it? I didn't have an answer, and I couldn't force one. The longer I went without that answer, the easier it became for the people around me to create one of their own. By then, Mark had already started saying things. Quiet things. To his mother first. That maybe I was the problem. That maybe I simply couldn't. At the time, I had no idea how far a quiet lie can travel when the right person decides to carry it. Carol Bishop ran the women's circle at her church the way a general runs a campaign. She had lost her husband young and raised Mark on her own, and somewhere through those difficult years, she convinced herself that her son was proof she hadn't failed. He had to be perfect, because if he wasn't, then what had all that sacrifice been for? So when Mark quietly suggested that the problem was probably me, Carol never questioned it. Not once. She picked up the story and ran with it. At first, it was subtle. A sympathetic sigh at a potluck, a hand resting on someone's arm, a lowered voice. Poor Mark. He wanted children so badly. Then it grew sharper. At a church supper that fall, she introduced me to a visiting pastor's wife with a look of well-practiced pity. "This is Myra," she said. "My daughter-in-law. She's a doctor, you know. Such a shame about the children." The woman gave me a sad, understanding nod, and I realized that whatever story had been told about me had already arrived before I did. I stood there in my nice dress, balancing a paper plate, while Carol patted my hand as though I were the one who needed comforting. Then she said the things she would repeat for years, the things she delivered the way other people say grace. Some women just aren't built for it. She smiled when she said it. She believed it. That was the worst part. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She was simply repeating what her son had given her, polished, certain, and unquestioned. She had no idea those words were a lie speaking through her own voice. I drove home that night and said nothing to Mark. I should have. But I was still waiting for the truth to sort itself out. Paige Dolan had been my best friend since we were 15. We met in a high school chemistry class and stayed close through everything that followed. My move away for school, her string of jobs that never quite lasted. 2 states, a dozen years. She was the person I called when my father died. She stood beside me at my wedding in a green dress and cried during my vows. So when the church gossip started getting under my skin, Paige was the person I leaned on. She would come over with wine and let me vent. She always seemed to know exactly what to say. Or at least, that's what I thought. Looking back now, every piece of comfort she offered carried a hook. "You're so accomplished, Myra. Maybe that's just not your path." "Mark adores you. Don't let his mother get in your head." "You don't need a baby to be whole." They were kind words, every one of them, but they always landed on the same bruise. They always brought me back to the thing I supposedly lacked. At the time, I didn't notice how often her gaze drifted toward Mark across the room. I didn't notice how she somehow knew details about his schedule that I had never told her. I was too busy feeling grateful that at least one person didn't seem to be judging me. She sat on my couch in my living room, telling me I deserved better, and I nodded, never once considering that she might mean she deserved my life. People like Paige don't take what belongs to you all at once. They borrow it piece by piece, and then one day you look up and it's gone, and they're standing inside it as though it had always belonged to them. I trusted her completely. That was the second mistake I didn't know I was making. Mark filed for divorce on a Tuesday. I came home after a shift and found a manila envelope sitting on the kitchen counter, and half of his closet already empty. He didn't even tell me himself. By the weekend, he had moved into Paige's apartment across town, and by then, the story had already been written. The version circulating was neat and cruel. Myra was cold. Myra cared more about her job than her marriage. Myra couldn't give him children. And a man wants a family, doesn't he? Carol made sure every pew heard that version. Paige, my Paige, never said a word to correct it. The two people who had known me longest allowed me to become a cautionary tale. And I didn't fight back. Because fighting felt too much like proving them right. I never posted anything online. I didn't call a single person to defend myself. The next morning, I went to work, set a teenager's broken arm, and told him he was going to be fine. And he was. That felt like the only true thing I did all week. If you've ever swallowed a lie about yourself just to keep the peace, to preserve a family, a friendship, or a reputation you spent years building, then you know exactly what that tastes like. It tastes like blood you're not allowed to spit out. Stay with me, because this is where I began to understand something. The peace I was protecting so carefully was never mine to protect. It belonged to the people lying about me. They were the ones who needed my silence. Comment truth if you've ever been there, and keep watching, because the silence didn't last. I want to tell you about the day a hospital board taught me that some things are worth getting loud about. The story stopped being about my marriage the day it walked into my hospital. For years, I had been next in line to lead the emergency department. I had helped build the trauma protocols that half the county now used. The position was practically mine, and everyone knew it. Then the whispers reached the credentialing committee. Not the truth. There was no truth to uncover. Just the outline of it. Dr. Spencer's personal life is unstable. There are concerns about her judgment. Did you hear about the divorce? About what her husband's family has been saying. One board member, a man who played golf with Mark's uncle, began asking pointed questions about whether I was fit to lead under pressure, as though I hadn't spent the last decade staying calm while people bled out on my table. When the position was finally announced, it went to someone with half my hours and none of the protocols I had created. They told me I was a strong candidate. They told me it had been a difficult decision. What they didn't tell me was the real reason. But I had grown up in a small town. I knew exactly what a verdict sounded like when it was dressed up as a compliment. That was the night something changed inside me. A lie about my body had already cost me my marriage, and I had allowed it because I believed enduring it was the decent thing to do. But now that same lie was reaching into the one place I had never allowed anyone to touch. My work, my name, the thing I had sacrificed for. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, just as I had years earlier while reading those normal test results, and I realized that the silence I had been so proud of came with a price. And someone else had been quietly adding to the bill. A nurse I trusted gave me the name of a lawyer named Ruth Calloway. Ruth's office sat above a hardware store. She wore reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and looked at people as though she were already 3 moves ahead. I told her everything: the marriage, the church gossip, the board, the promotion I had lost. She listened without interrupting, which is not something lawyers often do. When I finished, she set down her pen. "What you're describing could be defamation," she said. "Possibly false light. But I won't pretend otherwise. It's difficult." She explained it plainly. To win, we would need to prove 3 things: that a specific false statement had been made, that it had been communicated to other people, and that it had caused real, measurable harm. "The harm part is already there," she said. "A lost promotion is a number. A salary is a number. That's the easy part." I sat there turning my grandmother's watch around my wrist. "And the false part?" Ruth looked at me over the top of her glasses. "That's the part you have to be willing to fight over in public. They'll argue the statement is true. They'll say you really couldn't have children. To win, you'll need to be prepared to prove it wasn't you." I felt my stomach sink. Because of course I couldn't prove that. My results were normal, but a normal result doesn't identify who was responsible for the silence. It only proves that it wasn't me. I almost stood up and walked out. The entire thing felt like an invitation for the town to dissect me. Then Ruth said exactly what I needed to hear. "Silence isn't a virtue, Myra, when it's costing you your career. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is make them prove what they're saying." I didn't answer immediately, but I didn't leave either. I spent 2 weeks thinking about it. I'm not impulsive. I make decisions the same way I read a chart. Slowly, then all at once. I made a list of everything I stood to lose. The church community that had watched me grow up. My reputation in a town where half the people already believed the worst. The inevitable gossip. People calling me bitter, calling me cold, saying I was the kind of woman who sued her ex-husband's family out of spite. I knew exactly how that version of the story would sound. They had already written most of it. Then I made a second list: my name, my work, the truth, and the simple reality that I had done nothing wrong and was being punished anyway. I kept coming back to one thing. I wasn't doing this to hurt Mark. If I had wanted to hurt him, I'd had an entire year to try. I was doing it so a hospital board would stop believing a story that wasn't true, so that the next time my name was mentioned in a room where I wasn't present, it would be mentioned cleanly. That was the line I drew, and I drew it deliberately. This wasn't going to be revenge. Revenge is loud, hungry, never satisfied. This would be the truth, spoken once, in a place where it mattered, by someone who had finally decided she was done carrying a lie that belonged to other people. I called Ruth on a Monday morning before my shift and told her I was in. "Good," she said. "Then let's make them say it under oath." I hung up, walked into the trauma bay, and had the steadiest day I'd experienced in a year. It turns out a settled mind creates its own kind of calm. Over the next few weeks, Ruth drafted the complaint. It listed the specific statements, the dates, the witnesses who had heard them. It detailed the lost promotion, the salary difference, and the documented damage to my professional reputation. Reading it felt strange. My entire quiet humiliation had been organized, numbered, and transformed into something tangible, something with weight. Once it was filed, the news spread through town faster than any ambulance I'd ever ridden in. "Myra Spencer is suing the bishops!" Carol was furious. She told the women's circle that I had become vengeful and godless, that the grief of my empty house had turned me cruel. She doubled down on every statement she had ever made, which, though she didn't realize it, was exactly what Ruth had hoped she would do. Mark stayed quiet at first, so did Paige, but messages started arriving. Some were cruel, some were curious. A few came quietly from women whose own reputations had been rewritten by people who claimed to love them. One message simply said, "Good for you. They did the same thing to my sister." I didn't respond to any of them. I kept showing up to work and let the case move at the pace of the legal system, which is to say, slowly. Ruth told me the next step would be the response from the other side. The way Mark's lawyer chose to defend the statements would shape everything. "They have two options," she said. "They can argue the comments were opinions, hurt feelings, nothing legally actionable. That route is irritating, but it's survivable for them." She tapped her pen against the desk. "Or they can plant their flag and insist the statements were true, that you really were the reason. That's the route I'm hoping they take." I asked her why. She smiled like someone who already knew how the answer ended. "Because then they have to prove it, and proving it means opening a door." They chose the second option. Of course they did. Mark's lawyer filed a response that planted the flag exactly where Ruth had hoped. Their defense, put simply, was that the statements about me were not defamation because they were true. I really had been the reason our marriage never produced children. The fault, they argued in court filings, was medical, and it was mine. When Ruth called to tell me, I could hear something close to satisfaction beneath her steady voice. "You just said the magic words," she told me. "Truth is a defense. But here's what they didn't think through." She paused for a moment. "To prove the statement is true, to prove you were the infertile one, they'd have to put both of your medical situations in front of a court. Now, I'm not going to oversell it. Reproductive records are among the most private records there are, and judges don't hand them over lightly. We'd still have to convince the court that it's relevant and narrowly tailored. But they just argued, under oath, that the cause was definitely you. They can't make that claim and then refuse to let anyone look at him. That's the crack. It's not a door swinging wide open. It's a crack. I can work with a crack." I lowered myself slowly into a chair at my kitchen table. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Ruth said. "They just put Mark's fertility at issue. He spent years hiding behind it with her. By swearing to it in court, he may have given us a reason to finally ask questions about him. No promises, but it's the best opening we've had." For 6 years, my body had been the subject of discussion at potlucks and prayer circles. And in trying to make those claims official, in trying to win by repeating them in court, the bishops had done the one thing they had never been willing to do. They had opened the door to examining Mark. I thought about all the times he refused testing, the sharp little speeches, the way every conversation seemed to slam shut the moment it turned toward him. I didn't say anything else to Ruth, but a thread I had buried long ago had suddenly twitched, and I felt it move. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always do when something refuses to sit right. I went back through the timeline in my mind, slowly and carefully, the same way I would reread an old chart looking for the detail I missed the first time. And there it was. 7 years earlier. A morning early in our marriage when Mark had driven into the city alone for what he called a routine physical. He had been gone all day. When he came home, something about him was different. He was quiet in a way that wasn't normal for him, short-tempered over nothing. Before dinner, he poured himself a drink, something he never did on a weekday. I asked whether everything was okay. He said the doctor was a quack, that the entire trip had been a waste of time, and then he changed the subject so abruptly it left an impression. And that was the part that kept me staring at the ceiling. After that day, he never mentioned testing again. Not once. Before the city trip, he had at least pretended to take the conversation seriously. Afterward, the subject was simply closed, and somewhere during those same weeks, the first whispers about me began. At the time, I filed it away as nothing more than a man irritated by a wasted afternoon. I never connected it to anything, because I wasn't looking for a lie. You don't investigate the people you love. But now, with Ruth's words still echoing in my head, that quiet day in the city looked less like a wasted trip and more like the moment a decision had been made. I didn't have proof. I want to be clear about that. What I had was a memory and a bad feeling, and in a courtroom, that's nothing. But it was enough to tell Ruth where to start looking. The next morning, that's exactly what I did. Ruth listened to my story about the city trip without taking a single note, which I had learned meant she was listening very closely. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment. "On its own, that's nothing," she said. "A memory of a bad mood. But it's a reason to ask the right question." She explained what would happen next, because the other side had made my fertility part of the case, and because they had specifically argued that I and not Mark was the cause. Ruth could ask the court to compel production of Mark's relevant medical records. "If he wants to claim it was you," she said, "the law allows me to ask whether it was him. That's how this works. You can't open a door halfway." She filed the motion the following week. Mark's lawyer fought it aggressively. And that was when I realized I had touched something real. Because nobody fights that hard over nothing. They argued privacy. They argued relevance. They argued every point they could think of to keep that single folder closed. A hearing was scheduled, and I had to live with not knowing. For someone like me, that is its own special kind of torture. I'm used to ordering a test and receiving an answer. This was different. This was asking a judge for permission to even look. I returned to my shifts. I set bones, read scans, tried not to think about a folder I had never seen, sitting in the archives of some city clinic, containing either everything or nothing. Ruth told me to be patient. "Courts move slowly on purpose," she said. "It gives the truth time to stop being scary." I wasn't afraid of the truth. I never had been. What scared me was the possibility that they would find a way to keep me from it. Before the judge could rule on the motion, Ruth needed me to sign a verified complaint. A sworn version of everything. Every statement, every date, every witness. All of it affirmed under penalty of perjury. She placed the document on the desk between us. A thick stack of papers with colored tabs marking every place my name appeared. "Read all of it," she said. "Then sign only what you know is true." So I read it. Every line. The potluck, the pastor's wife, the exact words Carol had spoken at the church supper. The comment about how some women just aren't built for it. The board meeting. The salary I lost. Reading those quiet years of my life laid out in numbered paragraphs did something to me. It made the lie look exactly as fragile as it truly was. I picked up the pen Ruth handed me and noticed the smell of the room. Not the clean antiseptic scent of my hospital, my old refuge. This room smelled of paper, ink, and the dust drifting up from the hardware store below. For years, the smell of the hospital had meant safety. It was the one place where no one called me hollow. Now I was somewhere entirely different. Somewhere I had stepped into the open to reach, and I wasn't hiding anymore. I lowered the pen to the page. The thin gold watch slid cool against my wrist as I signed, and I thought of my grandmother, who used to say that patience isn't waiting. It's recognizing the right moment when it arrives. This was that moment. My signature went down clean and steady, the surest thing I had written in a year. When I lifted the pen, it was done. The complaint was verified. The motion was active. Whatever was inside that folder in the city, the process of finding it had begun. And I was the one who had set it in motion. Ruth gathered the papers and tapped them neatly into a stack. "Now we wait for a judge," she said. I nodded. For the first time, waiting didn't feel like helplessness. It felt like a fuse. The ruling came on a gray afternoon during a slow shift. Ruth called, and I stepped into a supply closet to answer, surrounded by gauze and saline bags, my heart doing something it never did at work. "The judge granted it," she said. "With limits, but she granted it." She explained the decision carefully, the way she explained everything. Because the defense had explicitly claimed that the infertility was mine, the court found that Mark's relevant fertility records had become, in the judge's words, presumptively discoverable. Not automatically public, not open season. The records would be produced under a protective order, reviewed first by the attorneys and the court, and used only as necessary for the case. "It's not proof of anything yet," Ruth said, always cautious. "We don't know what's in the file. There may be nothing, but they can't keep it closed anymore." Standing in that supply closet, I released a breath I felt as though I'd been holding for 7 years. Across town, I later learned, the news landed very differently. Mark's lawyer reportedly requested a private meeting that same day. Carol called Ruth's office twice and was politely informed that the attorney could not speak with her. And for the first time, the people who had spent years deciding what was true about my body became noticeably uncomfortable with the idea of a court deciding what was true about Mark's. I didn't celebrate. I want that understood. I didn't text anyone. I didn't grin at my reflection. I finished my shift, completed my charts, and drove home to my apartment alone. But that night, I slept straight through for the first time in months. Because I knew the folder was coming. And I knew that folders, unlike people, don't know how to lie. The first sign that something was wrong on their side didn't come from Mark or Carol. It came from Paige. Out of nowhere, after a year of silence, she sent me a text. "Please don't do this. Think about the baby." I read it 3 times. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. She had taken my husband and my life and never once reached out. And now she was suddenly pleading with me to stop a lawsuit that, on its face, had nothing to do with her. That was the part that caught my attention. The case was between me, Mark, and Carol. It was about statements made about my body, about the promotion I had lost. Why would Paige, who supposedly had everything she wanted, be afraid of it? Why would a woman with the baby, the husband, and the house be texting her former best friend at midnight, asking her not to keep digging? People who beg you to stop digging usually know what's buried. I had learned that lesson the hard way over the previous year. I didn't reply. I simply sat with a question, turning it over in my mind, feeling the outline of something I couldn't see yet. By then, I had figured something out, and I want you to hear it if you've ever been the calm person in the middle of a storm. The people most afraid of the truth are rarely the people it's meant to land on. I wasn't angry with Paige. I was curious, deeply curious, wide awake curious. If a story about a quiet woman finding her backbone is your kind of story, subscribe so the next chapter finds you. And tell me in the comments where you would have stopped. Because I almost did. Twice. But Paige's message didn't make me want to stop. It made me want to keep going. A frightened person had just told me, without realizing it, that there was more buried in the ground than I knew. The folder arrived 8 days later, and I want to be precise about how because it matters. I did not see it first. I couldn't have, and I wouldn't have. I'm a doctor, and there are medical records I have no right to access. Not my ex-husband's, not anyone's. That's the law, and it's a good law. The records went to Ruth through the proper legal channels under the protective order established by the judge. She reviewed them with opposing counsel present, exactly as the process required. Then she called me and asked me to come to her office. She had never done that before. I knew something before I even sat down. She wore the careful expression people wear when they're about to hand you something heavy. 7 years ago, she said. Mark went to a clinic in the city. The one you remembered. She slid a single page toward me. Only the line that mattered was visible. Everything else had been blacked out under the court seal. The diagnosis was a word I had written in charts hundreds of times. Azoospermia. No measurable sperm. Mark had been told in plain clinical language that he could not father a biological child. 7 years earlier. The same week he came home withdrawn and different. The same week he quietly closed the subject forever. The same stretch of weeks when the whispers about me first began. I sat very still. Ruth watched me the way you watch a patient after delivering scan results. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply felt something vast and quiet shift back into place inside me, like a bone settling into its proper joint. For 6 years, I had been the broken one, the barren one, the shame of the Bishop family. And the man who had allowed an entire town to believe that had known all along that the empty house was his. I drove home with that single sheet of paper folded inside my bag and never turned on the radio. I thought I would feel triumphant. I had even prepared myself for that possibility, worried about it, because I didn't want to become someone who took pleasure in another person's downfall. But triumph never arrived. What came instead was something stranger and sadder, something close to grief. 6 years of my life had been spent carrying a wound that was never mine. Every sympathetic glance at church, some women just aren't built for it. Every night spent awake wondering what was wrong with me, what I had failed to provide, why my body had supposedly failed the marriage. All of it had been part of a story Mark created to hide a truth he could not face about himself. He handed his shame to me and let me wear it in public for years. And his mother had fastened it in place with both hands. I sat in my car outside my apartment, the place I always seemed to end up at the turning points of my life, and I said something out loud to no one. The same thing I had said to Carol in that hospital hallway. Is that what you believe? Only now I understood what I had been asking all along. I had asked it of a woman who was completely certain I was broken. And the answer, the real answer, had been sitting inside a sealed folder in a city an hour away the entire time. I wasn't broken. I never had been. The relief didn't come like fireworks. It came like a long exhale, like taking a full breath after months of breathing shallowly. And beneath that relief, another question was already beginning to rise. One I couldn't push away. Here was the question, and once it formed, I couldn't stop asking it. If Mark could not father a child 7 years ago, if the clinic had been correct, if the diagnosis still held, then the baby boy Carol had boasted about in that hallway, the son Mark had proudly paraded through the maternity ward, the child he had supposedly left me to have with my best friend, could not be his. The math was brutal, even if it wasn't entirely simple. A man with that diagnosis almost never fathers a child naturally. Not impossible in rare circumstances, but extraordinarily unlikely without treatment Mark had never pursued. That left a contradiction too large to ignore. Either the clinic had been catastrophically wrong, which can happen, though rarely, or the baby everyone in town believed was Mark Bishop's son had been fathered by someone else. I wasn't going to pretend I knew which answer was correct, but I knew it was a question that deserved a real answer, not another rumor. And suddenly Paige's text made terrible, perfect sense. Please don't do this. Think about the baby. She hadn't been worried about my lawsuit hurting Mark's feelings. She had been worried about what a courtroom full of medical records might bring into the open. Because Paige knew something the rest of the town didn't. She knew who the baby's father really was. I want to be careful about what I did and did not do, because that matters to me. I did not go searching through the baby's records. I had no right to do that, and I never would have. The child was innocent in all of this, and I have never wished anything for that child except the best. What I did have was a contradiction sitting in plain view, created entirely by the bishop's own legal defense. They had sworn that the infertility was mine. The records said it was Mark's. And a healthy baby boy living across town suggested that someone was lying about something far bigger than a marriage. I called Ruth. "I think there's more buried here," I told her. She didn't hesitate. "Then let's allow the court to find it, not us." The court. The man who walked into the hospital room that day, the man I mentioned at the very beginning of this story, had a name. Daniel Reyes. I didn't know him then. I learned about him the same way I learned everything else in this story. Slowly. Properly. Through channels that don't lie. It turned out that during the months Paige and Mark were getting involved, while Mark was still telling the world that his wife was the broken one, Paige had also been involved with someone else. Daniel. By all accounts, he was a quiet man who had been led to believe the relationship meant more than it actually did. When Paige chose Mark, she cut Daniel out completely, blocked his number, never told him she was pregnant, never mentioned a due date, never told him which hospital. She gambled that he would simply disappear, that he would never connect the pieces. But something about the timeline never felt right to him. So he kept asking quiet questions among the few people they both knew. That very morning, one of them accidentally mentioned the hospital and the date. So Daniel came, to see the child he suspected was his. And the moment he stepped through that door, he became the one person Paige had been certain would never find her. Paige's face lost every trace of color. That is the image I want you to remember. Carol standing by the elevators, smug and certain that her son's perfect life proved my worthlessness. And 5 steps behind her, walking toward the maternity room, the living evidence that the perfect life had been built on the same kind of lie they had buried me beneath for years. I didn't create that moment. I didn't even understand it when it happened. I simply smiled at Carol and asked whether that was really what she believed. Then a door opened. A stranger walked through it, and an entire house of lies began quietly collapsing without me lifting a finger. Daniel, as it turned out, had questions that a court could answer. And in a town where everyone had been so certain they knew the truth about my body, the truth about everyone else's was finally about to have its day. Mark knew. That is the part I keep coming back to. The part that transforms this from sad into unforgivable. He had known for 7 years that he could not father a child. So when Paige became pregnant, he knew with complete certainty that the baby was not his. And he accepted it anyway. He stood before his mother, his church, and his entire small-town world, and allowed them to believe he had finally gotten the son he wanted. The son his supposedly barren first wife had failed to give him. He used a child who wasn't his to complete the story that had destroyed me. Think about the audacity of that. The cruelty wasn't even the affair, or the lie about my body, though both were bad enough. It was the fact that he looked at a baby he knew could not be his and saw, above all else, a prop. Proof of his manhood. The final period at the end of the sentence he'd been writing about me for years. I genuinely tried to find some sympathy for him. I'm not a hard person by nature, but every time I reached for it, I ran into the same wall. He had been given 100 opportunities to tell the truth and quietly let me go. Instead, he built a monument to a lie and placed a real child on top of it. When Ruth told me that Mark's lawyer had gone silent, no more motions, no more fighting, only a request to discuss resolving the matter, I understood exactly why. Mark was no longer afraid of losing the lawsuit. He was afraid of what the lawsuit would reveal publicly about the son he had been proudly displaying. For 7 years, he had controlled the narrative, and for the first time, that narrative was about to slip completely out of his hands. Carol came to see me before the hearing. She arrived at my apartment on a Sunday wearing her church clothes, and I nearly didn't answer the door. When I finally opened it, she looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that because, for a moment, I thought she might. She stood in my doorway and asked me, her voice carrying a visible crack, to drop the lawsuit. "Not for Mark," she said. "For the family, for the baby, for the name." And as she spoke, I saw something I hadn't expected. I saw a woman who had been deceived by her own son for 7 years, a widow who had poured everything she had into raising one boy and built her identity around the certainty that he was good. She hadn't spread those cruel words because she was malicious. She spread them because Mark handed them to her, polished, confident, and complete. And she loved him too much to question them. For a single moment, standing there in my doorway, I felt for her. She was human. She had been used, too. But then she said it again, the line she had carried for years. Only this time it came as a plea rather than a declaration. "Some women just aren't built for it, Myra. Why drag everyone through the mud over it?" And I understood that even now, standing at the edge of the truth, she would rather protect the lie than release it. Sympathy is not the same thing as surrender. I could recognize her pain and still refuse to carry her son's shame for one more day. "Carol," I said quietly, "go home. The mud was never mine." She left without another word. I closed the door, and I didn't feel cruel. I felt finished. Mark's lawyer offered a settlement, a quiet one. They would pay a sum of money, issue a private retraction to the hospital board, and clear my professional record if I agreed to seal everything and never speak about it again. Ruth placed the offer on her desk and watched me. "It's a good deal on paper," she said. "You'd get your name back. The board would hear the truth. You could walk away with everything you came for." She wasn't wrong. On paper, it was a win. Everything I had claimed to want. My reputation restored. My career back on track. My promotion within reach again. And all I had to do was allow the truth to be whispered behind closed doors and then locked away forever, while Carol continued repeating her line at church, while Mark continued showing off a son who wasn't his, and while the story about the broken doctor remained half alive in the corners of town, where private corrections never reach. I thought about it for a long time. Then I told Ruth no. Not out of spite. I want to be clear about that because the distinction matters. I didn't refuse because I wanted to watch Mark suffer. I refused because a private truth is just a quieter version of the same lie. For 6 years they had spoken about me publicly, in churches, at potlucks, in rooms where everyone could hear. The correction belonged in the same places, not as a whisper, not hidden in a drawer. The truth, spoken once, where it mattered, in front of the same people who had believed the lie. "I'm not going to whisper an apology for a wound he handed me," I told Ruth. "I'll say it once where it counts, and then I'm done carrying it." Ruth capped her pen and smiled. "Then we go to court," she said. "We're something you can breathe in." The hearing took place at the county courthouse on a bright, cold morning. I expected to be nervous. I had worked through 1,000 emergency codes without my hands shaking. But this felt different. Because this time, the thing on the table was me. The room filled in a way that revealed everything about how small towns operate. 2 members of the hospital board were there to see what they had gotten wrong. Several women from Carol's church circle attended, the same women who had nodded along to her pity for years. Carol herself sat rigidly in the second row. Mark sat beside his attorney, pale and sweating inside a suit that no longer fit him properly. And Paige sat near the back, holding herself unnaturally still while a quiet man named Daniel sat 2 rows behind her, his presence something she could feel without ever turning around. I sat beside Ruth and felt the entire structure of the previous 7 years gathered into a single room. For 6 years, these people had been the audience to my humiliation. They had watched a woman be quietly branded and said nothing. Or worse, repeated it. Now they were the audience to something else. That was the part I had insisted on. The part Ruth understood. The lie had been public. The truth had to be public, too. In front of the same eyes. Otherwise, it would never truly undo what had been done. I wasn't there to shout. I had decided that weeks earlier. I was there to let the truth stand in the light and be counted, with witnesses, on the record, in the one kind of room where speaking falsely under oath carries a price. The judge took her seat. The room fell silent, and I felt my grandmother's watch, cool and steady against my wrist, marking the moment I had waited 7 years to reach. Ruth never raised her voice once. That's what I remember most. She built the case the way you build a diagnosis, one finding at a time. Calm, methodical, unhurried, until only one conclusion remained standing. She established the statements, the dates, the witnesses. Carol's own words repeated at potlucks and prayer circles, that some women just aren't built for it. She established the harm, the lost promotion, the salary, the documented damage to my reputation. Then she turned to the defense's own claim, that the statements were true, that the infertility was mine, and she asked the court to consider the records that the defense itself had brought into the case by making that argument. Under the protective order, only the necessary line was read aloud. 7 years earlier, Mark Bishop had been diagnosed at a city clinic with a condition that made fathering a biological child medically impossible. The temperature in the room seemed to change. I watched the women from Carol's church turn toward her, and Carol had gone as white as paper. Then Ruth, gentle as ever, placed the contradiction on the table, the one the bishops had built with their own hands. The defense had sworn that the childless marriage was my fault. The records showed it was Mark's. And there was, by the family's own proud account, a baby boy. She pointed out that the question of that child's paternity had become relevant to support and custody matters already before a related court, and that genetic testing in that proceeding had not supported Mark's biological paternity. She stated it plainly, no drama, no flourish, the way you would read a lab result. And that was when Mark stood up. "That's not, you can't." His voice cracked through the courtroom. The judge instructed him to sit down. Carol was on her feet too, saying my name like an accusation, insisting it couldn't be true, insisting I had twisted everything. The two of them loud and unraveling, me sitting perfectly still at the table, saying nothing at all. Then Carol turned toward me, the way a drowning person reaches for the nearest thing. Her composure was gone. The certainty she carried through church suppers and prayer circles had split apart. And from the wreckage came the only words she had left. "Some women just are built for it," she cried, pointing a trembling finger across the room. "Some women just aren't." She couldn't even finish the sentence the second time. I rose slowly. I had waited 7 years. I wasn't going to rush it. I didn't raise my voice. I kept it level and clear, the same voice I use when I have to tell a family something difficult and true. The kind of voice that stays calmer than the room around it. "You're right, Carol," I said. The entire courtroom fell silent. "You're exactly right. One person in this marriage was never built to have children." I let the words settle. I looked at Mark, then back at his mother. The file only ever had his name on it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a hymn was playing, the one from my wedding, the one Carol had chosen, the one that drifted through that church on the day I married into all of this. Back then, it had meant one thing. Now it meant the exact opposite. Carol's hand fell to her side. Mark buried his face in his hands. And the women from the church circle, the same women who had nodded along to my humiliation for years, sat quietly as the truth settled over them and rearranged everything they thought they knew. I wasn't built wrong. I never had been. The man who had allowed an entire town to believe otherwise sat 6 feet away, coming apart, while the calm woman he called broken stood firmly on her own feet. I had said it once, out loud, where it mattered, and I was already setting it down. What happened afterward wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine. There was no shouting match. No one was dragged out. It was quieter than that. And somehow, for the bishops, that made it worse. Mark didn't deny it again. He couldn't. He sat with his head lowered while his own lawyer requested a recess. When the judge granted it, he didn't move. He remained there, hunched inside his ill-fitting suit, a man watching 7 years of carefully constructed storytelling collapse in a single morning. The women from church gathered their coats and purses and filed out with their eyes lowered. And I knew that by evening, the truth would be traveling through town just as quickly as the lie ever had. Carol followed them out, smaller than I had ever seen her, no longer the general of any campaign. And Paige slipped out during the recess, but not before Daniel stood from his seat 2 rows behind her and walked out the same door close behind. The question of that child's paternity was heading somewhere now. For the first time, it could be answered honestly. I remained seated at the table and let everything empty itself around me. Ruth rested a hand on my shoulder. "You did that without raising your voice," she said. "I've been doing this for 30 years. You'd be surprised how rare that is." The measurable consequences came afterward, the way they usually do. Mark standing in town, the thing he had protected at my expense for years, simply disappeared. You can't outrun a courthouse in a town that small. Within a few months, he left, moved 2 states away to a place where no one knew the story yet. He had spent 7 years making sure everyone believed a lie about me. In the end, the truth didn't need me to chase him. It only needed to be spoken once in the right room. The hospital board didn't make a spectacle of anything, which suited me just fine. A few weeks after the hearing, the chair asked to meet with me. He was one of the 2 board members who had sat in that courtroom, and he wore the uncomfortable expression of a man who had believed the wrong thing and knew it. He told me the department leadership position was open again. He told me they had reviewed everything and concluded that the earlier concerns about my judgment and stability had no foundation. He never quite apologized, but he came close. And from a hospital board, close is usually all you get. I accepted the position, not because I needed one more victory, but because it had always been mine, built through my own work, my own years, and I wasn't going to let a lie keep it from me for one more day. During my first week leading the department, I walked into the trauma bay and breathed in that familiar scent of clean cotton and antiseptic. The smell that once represented safety because it was the only place where nobody called me hollow. It smelled different now. It smelled like something I had earned, something I had reclaimed, not a place where I hid. I ran my first code as department lead with hands as steady as they had ever been. Afterward, standing at the sink washing up, I caught my reflection in the dark window, and I didn't recognize the exhaustion that used to live in my face, because it was gone. I want to tell you I felt vindicated, and I did, but more than that, I felt light, as though I had carried a sack of stones for 7 years, without realizing the handle was right there, and someone had finally shown me that I was allowed to put it down. People always want to know what happened afterward, so let me tell you. Then I'll let you go. Mark left, like I said. The last I heard, he was somewhere out west, starting over in a place that hadn't heard the story yet. I don't wish him harm. I don't wish him much of anything anymore. and that is its own kind of freedom. Carol lost the thing she had built her identity around. Not because I took it from her. I never spoke against her at that church. But because the truth about her son was simply too large to keep contained in a town that size. The women's circle she had led for 30 years quietly continued without her. I heard she stopped attending, and I felt a small, genuine sadness about that. The kind of sadness you feel for someone who chose the lie right up until it cost them everything. Paige and Daniel resolved the matter of the baby through the courts, the proper way. And for that child's sake, I hope they found something steady on the other side of it. That little boy never asked for any of this. Paige and I never spoke again. Some friendships don't actually break. They simply reveal that they were never what you believed them to be, and then you set them down with everything else. As for me, I kept the job, kept the apartment, kept the watch on my wrist. I filed nothing further. I had already gotten what I came for. My name was clear, and the truth could stand on its own. That was enough. There was one final thing I did, and then I was done. I wrote Carol a short note, not a long one, not an angry one. I thought about her standing in my doorway in her church clothes. A woman deceived by her own son who chose the lie anyway. And I realized I didn't want to carry anger toward her into the rest of my life. Anger is just another sack of stones. So I kept the note simple. I won't carry your son's lie anymore, I wrote. You shouldn't either. That was all. I didn't expect a reply, and none came. But writing it closed something. That night, I slipped my grandmother's watch from my wrist and held it for a moment, thinking about what she always used to say. Patience isn't waiting. It's recognizing the right moment when it arrives. I had waited 7 years for that moment. It came, and I met it. And now the time that watch had been measuring was no longer borrowed against some future reckoning. It was simply mine. The whole quiet remainder of my life, finally, completely mine. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, let it be this. The truth doesn't shout, and it doesn't chase. It simply waits, patient as a watch, waiting for the day someone stops being afraid and asks the right question out loud. That's my story. 6 years carrying a name that never belonged to me, and one quiet question that brought the whole thing down. If someone has ever told you that you were the broken one, let this be your reminder to stop carrying it. Speak your truth where it matters, then put it down. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.